Hey folks, Mark Scroggins here with Cindy Hyde. We're back talking about some sex and love addiction issues. And once again, really appreciate you being here today and discussing this with everyone. We had some very interesting questions from Mira McEwen, my Director of Business Development and Marketing, and that I think are really, really important to ask. So Mira, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and ask a few of those questions if you don't mind.
Sure. So earlier in the previous segment, you were talking about how addiction is something that you can't stop 6 months or longer. Mm-hmm. And so I had asked about sex being a natural thing. And is it all sex? Do you have to become celibate? Can you not masturbate? What is the, I guess, outlining addiction if you're not stopping within the 6 months?
Right.
Yeah, and when I say can't stop in the 6 months, you know, if they were having normal, healthy sex, you know, they could probably stop that on their own. But when it's excessive and it's acting out behavior, that's not something they can stop on their own. When it's become the central focus of their life and it's costing them a lot of money because maybe they're, you know, getting prostitutes or they're, you know, spending money on different things. And women's, you know, acting out is a little bit different than men's. And so they don't always.
Let me stop you there for just a second. And there are going to be times, and I don't mean to be rude,
that's okay.
but so there are two things that I kind of seized on there. One being women's acting out is different. And then there was the term excessive. And so much of that is subjective. I mean, because somebody having sex once a month, that might be just fine. And another person hears once a month, it's like, are you out of your freaking mind? Once a month? Holy shit, that didn't work for me. So how do you figure out, first, let's start with, how do you determine what's excessive? I mean, because that just seems so subjective.
Right. And from a therapy standpoint, we can tell excessive based on the assessments we run. However, you know, a person knows when, like, you know, for instance, if they were an alcoholic, if they're drinking too much, right?
Of course.
And so if they're leaving work to go act out with a prostitute, or they're leaving, or they're, you know, masturbating, you know, dozens of times a day, or, you know, even a little less than that, it can become, you know, where they're neglecting their children, they're neglecting their wife, they're neglecting their family, because the only thing on their mind is utilizing their drug, which is sex.
Okay, so would it be safe to say then, if it is basically interfering with your ability to live life?
Correct.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. And then you mentioned that women tend to act out differently than men. Can you explain that to folks?
And women can get into excessive masturbation too, but they also may act out in serial relationships. So they may layer relationships, or they may, you know, be picking up men at different bars on a nightly basis. It may not be in prostitution. They also utilize porn as well, and they can get pretty addicted to that too. But some of their behaviors may be different than men based on what they have access to or what their arousal template is.
Let me ask this, because one of the things that has also become really big within the last 5 years, we hear about people having emotional affairs, okay? No actual sex. There might have been some kissing at some point, but there generally doesn't seem to go beyond that. But they are having those intimate conversations with someone other than their spouse or significant other. Does that play any kind of a role in, say, the love addiction side as compared to sex addiction?
And, you know, sex and love addiction can actually go together.
Right.
And so just because someone is a sex addict doesn't mean they're not capable of also being a love addict. Sometimes they are both. You know, in the AA world, they say if you're codependent and an alcoholic, you're a double winner. Well, in the sex addiction world, it's kind of the same thing. They can be a sex and love addict and be kind of a double winner in that regard. And so, but, you know, an emotional affair, if it's serial and it's not something they can stop on their own, it's possible it could be playing in, but it's not always the case.
Okay. Well, so another thing, you know, anytime you have addiction as a disease is a difficult thing for a lot of people to wrap their head around, because so much of it manifests itself in a manner that is offensive to people. So, if somebody is, a violent drunk or is an unhappy, mean drunk, that manifests itself in a way that people are like, well, I don't want to be around you. That's different than somebody who, say, is afflicted with cancer and is going through chemotherapy and is really struggling, and they might act like an asshole, but you understand why, and people tend to forgive that, whereas with somebody who's just an unhappy drunk or a mean drunk, that's more difficult to forgive. I have never in my personal life had to deal with that, or with love or sex addiction. So I can only imagine how difficult that would be to have in a relationship and be able to come back from that. So for those that are out there going, holy shit, maybe I've got an issue, can you come back from that? Can you go from, if you're in a committed relationship, from all of these outside stimuli to coming back to and I hate using the term normal, but a relatively normal sex life with someone?
Yeah, you can, and it happens actually quite frequently. The first thing, we want a sex addict to do once it's been determined that is in fact what they're dealing with is to if their assessments are really high, then we may recommend that they go to a treatment center that specializes in sex addiction so that they can get that back under control. We always recommend some sort of recovery for them as well, and then typically either a men or women's group with a therapist to be sure that they're covering all the bases, because what we want them to learn is how to have healthy sex, and if they're in a committed relationship or in a marriage, it will be a requirement of their spouse most likely, or their partner, for them to get to a place where they can have healthy sex. And so, but like with any addiction, they could relapse again, and that's one of the things. But you touched on something that I thought was interesting, and it's so true. There's a lot of shame attached in any addiction, but even more so, it's so common now to hear somebody say, well, I was an alcoholic, or I've been sober 25 years from now. You're not going to be at a, dinner with friends and go, oh, by the way, I'm a sex addict, right? And so, it does attach more shame in a lot of cases. I work with a guy right now that he's like, he doesn't mind telling people at all, this is something that has afflicted me. But others, try to keep that more under wraps. But yes, they can get to a place of having a healthy sex life. But it takes a lot of work. I mean, they have to do the work. And Patrick Carnes has done some amazing workbooks and recovery programs for that very thing that a lot of therapists use. And I highly recommend that if anyone feels like that they have a sex addiction, that they seek out what's called a therapist that's called a CSAT. And it's CSAT, so it stands for Certified Sex Addiction Therapist.
Okay.
And that's the best place to start. And then also, there's so many recovery programs that I'll mention later as we go along. But,
okay.
So
Mary, you looked like you had a question.
I did have a question. So, we've been talking about treatment and recovery, and people saying that, yes, or admitting that I am a sex addict. So the first time that I had ever heard or seen anything like this before was in the media, right? So a famous person cheats on their spouse, and it happens frequently, right? And then they say, oh, I'm so sorry. Or a politician, they say, oh, I'm a sex addict and I'm going to go to treatment, right? Tiger Woods, he was one that went and had sex addiction treatment.
Very public, yeah.
Yes. So are these recovery centers, these treatments, these AA, or these AA groups, but these groups, these men and women groups, are they something that is readily available?
They are.
More often than not, because, you can look up AA or NA, and there are groups all over.
That's correct. And it's the same with SAA, Sex Addicts Anonymous, as well as SLAA, which is Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. Yeah, they have meetings pretty much all day, every day. The treatment, there's also a lot of treatment centers now are starting to recognize sex addiction as an addiction. And so they are opening up all over the place, or they're adding to their services that they already have for addiction, because they recognize that so much of the addictive process is the same across the board, whether it's alcohol, drugs, sex, gambling, that the addictive behavior is the same. And so, yeah, does that answer your question?
It does. Now, have you ever treated someone or come in contact with someone? I know some of my friends that were alcoholics, their therapist and their treatment say, don't stop smoking, quit one thing at a time.
Right.
So have you had one switch from one to the other, where they were a sex addict and now they become a love addict, or they were a love addict and now they become a sex addict because they're still trying to...
Or alcohol and Coke, and
Yes.
it's easy to go down the road on stuff.
Well, and it's called switching. And
Switching,
so when
okay.
you switch from one addiction to the other, typically you're not going to go from, if you're only a sex addict, to a love addict, because those actually usually are the ones that get together, and we'll talk about that probably soon. But if they're a sex love addict, they could switch over to gambling, or maybe they're drinking more, whatever. So that's one of the things that a lot of the treatment centers and therapists that work with these types of addiction do, is try to prevent the crossover or them switching. But a lot of times, almost, I wouldn't say always, but I would say a high percentage come in and they are already dual addicted. So they may, we see it a lot in women. Women can come in with love addiction and they also have a food addiction going on, or a food disorder going on. Or they may have a spending problem, because women typically that's the direction they'll go with their dual addictions. And so where men, it can be more sex, gambling, alcohol, drugs, and women too with alcohol and drugs. But yeah, it's common to either see a dual addiction or see them start trying to switch, because addict behavior is addict behavior. I've learned to self-soothe this way, and now I'm taking away something that's been a way that I've been able to self-soothe. So now I need something else, because I don't know how to do that in a healthy way yet. So that's why therapy and treatment are incredibly important in recovery.
So let me ask this, because you just used that term healthy again. And so how does, aside from the definition we talked about just a little bit ago, when it's, getting in the way of living life, so to speak, is there a checklist, so to speak? So like, excuse me, I know with alcoholism or with drugs, or, well, let's just go with those two. Generally, the AA has pamphlets all over the place of, a self-assessment, and you'll hear people talk about, determining whether or not the person is alcoholic or not is really an inside job. Only they can truly diagnose whether or not it is a problem. There can be lots and lots of evidence, that would lead one to believe. Right. But it is not a completely objective standard, right? It has to be subjective. Right. So is there something that is promulgated by, I guess, SLAA, or what'd you say, the other one? SAA, that gives a checklist of where people can go, you know what, I've got X and Y and Z, and so maybe I need to take another look. Is there something out there so people can go, well, is it just that I have a really active libido, or is it beginning to cross over? And I think, and here we go with my problems with with organized religion. It seems like, you have some that basically have come out and demonized it. If it's not for procreation, then, then it's bad. Right. And I just think that's such horseshit. I hate labeling all of that. So can we talk a little bit about what are the things that you would be on the lookout for that would tend to tell you that, hey, I need to at least talk to somebody and see, is everything okay? Or am I about to go down a dark road that I don't want to go down?
Yeah. And the thing about recovery from any addiction is, is to get honest.
Right.
Right. And so to be honest with yourself, and if you even feel like you know, I'm not so sure. Do I need to look into this? You know, getting an assessment run that will tell you the story. As long as you're honest, it's going to tell you the story, whether or not, you know, you should do more work around it. You know, but so often it takes a while for somebody to get honest with the behavior that they're doing, and so they will justify as, oh, I just have a high libido,
Right.
But you've cheated on your wife 17 times, so you know, so that's when things like that should be looked at. But you know, the thing about sex addiction where it's different is that you know, just like food addiction, you're not going to stop eating. Right.
Yeah.
And so, you know, what you're going to do is just find a healthier way to eat. And it's the same way with sex addiction. And so the first, you know, thing that gets broken down is the rituals that lead up to the acting out behavior. So just say cocaine was your drug of choice.
Right.
Well, a cocaine addict might, you know, get their tinfoil out and their, you know, pipe and whatever, and there's a whole ritual that leads up to, you know, smoking the cocaine or snorting it or whatever they
Right.
do. You know, they chop it up, whatever. And the sex addict does the same thing. And so first we start with the thinking.
Right.
You know, what's triggering the thinking that wants you to start the ritual.
Right.
And so once we can break down where the rituals are and stop those, that's when things start getting easier. And so then kind of the monster's out of the closet.
Right.
And they're able to start changing those patterns and behaviors. So, you know, just like, you know, with alcoholism, you know, everywhere you go, there's alcohol. You know,
Absolutely.
It's a very socially acceptable thing.
Right.
Sex is a very socially acceptable thing.
Right.
You know, in the world we live in today. And so, you know, you can drive down the Dallas Tollway right now, and there's a billboard of a practically naked woman in a bikini on the billboard. So, you know, the word I'm looking for, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
But anyway, you know, the images are everywhere.
Sure.
Just like there's alcohol, you can go in now a drugstore and there's alcohol there, right?
Yeah.
And it's the same thing. So, but it's breaking down, maybe don't go down that road. Let's go down a different road. And if you see an image, how do we break the ritual of you getting into that obsessive thinking? And so it really is a true process. And once they start feeling the relief of not having to act out anymore, they start living again. And they'll even in some of my clients are, you know, will say, I haven't felt this good in so long. And so they oftentimes, one, realize how much money they've spent on it, and
Right.
two, you know, that it was really owning them. And so just like with any, you know, addiction, alcohol, drugs, it owns the person that it has hold of. And so it doesn't usually take a long time for them to start feeling a lot better and not wanting that anymore,
Okay.
and wanting to have healthy sexuality in their life.
So I want to keep talking about this, but one of the things that I want to talk about when we come back here is I run into a lot of people that you know, come into my office for the first time, and they're, you know, my husband or wife is an alcoholic or a drug addict, and so that means, so let me rephrase that. So I know that means that X, and it's like, actually, that's not what that means at all. So, I mean, you find plenty of times with drug and alcohol that if somebody's in recovery and has been for a period of time, it can have virtually no impact on child custody matters. And I think you run into the same thing with virtually any kind of addiction, but I want to talk about that a little bit more as it relates to sex addiction in particular, and then a little bit with some of the other addictions as well. All right?
Okay.
All right. Folks, come on back. We're going to be talking about all kinds of sex, drugs, and rock and roll.